Greetings, and welcome back to the Record of Arms. I'm your host, Mark 7, and today I'm pleased to bring you the next part of my series on the combat career of the Brewster Buffalo. Last time we looked at the debacle that overwhelmed the Allied air defense in the first few days of the Pacific War in Malaya, resulting in the withdrawal of the battered remnants of Norgroup to the airfield of Ipoh. We'll take up the account today and see what use the Japanese made of their victory in the air here and ashore at Kota Bharu. As always, the sources used to prepare this video can be found in the description. With that said, let us continue. Despite the lack of Japanese bombing attacks on December 10th, northern Malaya was far from quiet. While the air assault had been driving the Allies out of the sky, troops landed at Singora and Patani had extinguished the isolated and sporadic Siamese resistance in the vicinity, and were forming up for the move southwards. This would go forward on the 10th, when the spearheads of 3 columns made up of elements of the 5th Division, backed by tank and artillery units, crossed the border into Malaya. 2 were aimed at the trunk road running south along the west coast, while the 3rd drove almost due south from Patani, crossing the border in its central sector, to intersect the river Perak and advance along it, threatening the Allied forces attempting to contain the Takumi detachment in the Kelantan province. Backing the 5th Division and the Takumi detachment was the remainder of 25th Army, namely the Imperial Guards Division, was advancing southwards through Siam from occupied French Indochina, along with the balance of the 18th Division. The Allied defense in the west bore the brunt of the attack, where a series of successive defensive positions began in front of the town of Jitra and extended down the road towards Al-Star. These were considered only partially complete. They were manned by troops of the 11th Indian Division, made up of Punjabi and Gurkha units, along with a British regiment. They had been intended to execute the seizure of Singora and Patani as envisaged in the Matador Plan, and been held at readiness for days before their orders were switched to this defensive role. They were badly equipped for resisting any kind of armor, having few anti-tank guns and no tanks of their own, or indeed any fighting vehicles more capable than a few armored scout cars and some Bren gun carriers. However, it is dubious how much difference these weapons would have made in the face of the 5th Division's superbly executed assault, quickly penetrating the first lines of resistance, and compelling the defenders to withdraw in some disorder after taking heavy losses. This brilliant assault was all the more notable as it was carried out by only a small vanguard force, and not on a divisional scale, and this force suffered only minor casualties. The retreat that began at Jitra would continue down the south road, with a brief stand at Sungai Kedah, until the Allies were south of Sungai Patani and retreating down the coast opposite the island of Penang. These opening engagements were fought, like the battle at Kota Bharu, with little air activity on either side. Heavy weather was a constant hindrance during this time, and both air forces were regrouping after the initial air battles. The Japanese were bringing in squadrons from Indochina to their newly acquired Siamese airfields, which they set to work improving. The 59th Sentai with 20 Hayabusas arrived at Nakhon Airfield on the 11th, joined by the 75th and 90th Sentais, flying Ki-48 Lily bombers, on the next day. 27 Ki-51 Sonia single-engine bombers set up at Singora during these same 2 days. The pause in the Japanese Army's bombing raids came to an end early on the 11th, when the island of Penang was hit by a force of 41 Ki-21 twin-engine bombers from the 12th and 60th Sentais, escorted by Ki-43s from the 64th Sentai. This attack was unopposed, and bombers hit the island's capital city of Georgetown and the shipping in the harbor. Georgetown lacked any air defense or air raid shelters. Many civilians, unacquainted with the brutal reality of modern warfare, came out into the streets to watch rather than seeking shelter. Many were killed and many fires started, which would burn unchecked as the fire station had also been demolished. A few of the Hayabusa escorts proceeded to land at Kota Bharu and refueled there with fuel drained from the tanks of wrecked Allied aircraft. The island was hit again the next day beginning at 0900. By Ki-51 and Ki-48 bombers, escorted by Hayabusas. Flights of 5 or 6 aircraft of these types would appear throughout the morning and the early afternoon, hitting the town, the harbor, and shipping in the Penang Channel, sending a few small patrol craft to the bottom. These raids would prove to be the beginning of an offensive against the island and its environs. Georgetown Harbor was a frequent target, and before long the British made the decision to abandon the island, and evacuate the European portion of the civilian population before getting ships away became impossible. Somewhat recovered from the disorganization caused by the retreat, the Allied air forces began to deploy to meet this new offensive, with their remaining resources on Singapore. 6 replacement Buffaloes were ordered forward to replace 21 Squadron's losses. To everyone's dismay, it was found that these planes were still in their crates and would need to be assembled. They wouldn't be available for 2 or 3 days. On the 12th, 4 Buffaloes from 243 Squadron, flown by Flying Officer Blondie Holder and Sergeants Jeff Fiskin, Bert Wapiti, and John Oliver, were sent to join the tattered remnants of 21 Squadron at Ipoh. That day, they were sent out on a strafing mission in support of the Army, but heavy rains over the target area prevented this. Instead, they split up into pairs. Holder and Fiskin reconnoitered the route Penang, Alor Star to Zingora, while Oliver and Wapiti headed towards Kelantan via Mersing. At Kelantan, they found the airfield apparently usable, although 6 blocks of buildings were gutted and a burnt-out Blenheim was visible on the airfield. At Zingora, they found large numbers of enemy aircraft on the ground, but returned without being engaged by the enemy, though they were by friendly flak on the way back, with Fiskin receiving a minor leg wound when his plane was hit. 453 Squadron was also ordered to send its planes forward from Semboang to reinforce Ipoh. They went in successive groups, and the first 3 were deployed forward to Butterworth on the 13th. This flight was led by Flight Lieutenant Doug Vanderfield. It hardly landed when they were sent off to intercept one of the raids on Penang that day. A force of Key 48s from the 75th and 90th Sentais, accompanied by Key 51s of the 59th Sentai, were approaching the harbor, and the 3 Buffalo pilots climbed into attack position using cloud cover to remain unseen, and then dove on the formation. Vanderfield recalled this action thus, quote, "We immediately took off and intercepted 3 Japanese bombers. As we attacked them, 5 or 6 dive bombers came out of the clouds and attacked us. We let them have the works, and definitely shot down 2 on the first attack. Sergeant pilot in my flight fired on a dive bomber that was trying to sit on my tail, and it rolled over and disappeared. Another went out to sea in a long dive." Vanderfield was credited with 2 Key 48s and a Key 51 in this action, despite the fact that a technical issue left him unable to retract his undercarriage. His wingmen, Sergeants Mac Reed and Bill Collier, also accounted for 3 Sonias between them. Collier recalls that day in these words, quote, "Vanderfield was having trouble with his undercarriage. His wheels were still down. Reed and I were in line astern, with Vanderfield leading. At about 7,000 feet, Vanderfield led an attack on a Betty. The port engine caught fire, and the aircraft dived into the sea. No one bailed out. I saw Vanderfield attack a Stuka-type aircraft, and then he disappeared. Thought we'd lost him. I was still flying line astern on Reed. He attacked another Stuka and pulled away in a climbing turn, and the Jap aircraft was on his tail. The Jap lined himself up nicely for me, so I shot him down. At this stage, I lost Reed. I attacked 2 more Stuka types. The second one was going downhill, trailing smoke. I was out of ammo. Reed caught up with me, and we returned to Butterworth to carry on with the refueling. Whilst refueling, I was called to the phone. I was told that the bridge over Alor Star River was blown. To go there, to attack transport on the road held up at the bridge. So Reed and I did that till we were out of ammo again. I was having trouble with my guns, as a common problem. We went back to Ipoh as per instructions. I was relieved that the first bloke that I saw was Vanderfield. Conditions at Ipoh were primitive. I must have lost contact with the rest of the team because I finished up sleeping in my aircraft. The last meal was breakfast before we left Semboang. The following days, things got a bit more organized. Sergeants were billeted at the railway pub. There was beer, food, and a bed. These minor successes show what the Buffaloes could accomplish when not handicapped by totally unreliable weapons. It should be noted, however, that no Japanese fighters were reported, although it is possible that Key 27 fighters were misidentified as dive bombers in this account. This almost certainly happened, since the Japanese admitted the loss of 1 Key 27 in this raid, which went down in the harbor. As mentioned in the first part of this series, unfounded rumors began to spread that the pilot of this fighter had bailed out and was fished out of the water and captured, found to be a German officer in a Luftwaffe uniform. It should be noted that though Collier seems to have been using the term Stuka or Stuka types in the above account to refer to a dive bomber in general, it's not unusual for Allied airmen to report German aircraft types such as Bf-109s or 110s over Malaya. These are all misidentified Japanese types. There were no German aircraft seen in this theater. A few of 243 Squadron's men would tangle with this raid as well. Jeff Fiskin, who would go on to make ace on the Buffalo, scored his first victory in this action. Quote, "My first encounter with the enemy took place over Ipoh Airdrome. I reckon a total of 13 Jap bombers were shot down here. Hackett must have been responsible for some, but not all, of the damage inflicted on the low-flying bombers. It was a case of flying in and out as quickly as possible. I made my first kill, a Jap Army 97 bomber, after diving on it from above. Later that day, the next group of 453 Squadron, 5 more fighters led by Battle of Britain veteran Flight Lieutenant Tim Viggers, proceeded to Butterworth after a short stop at Ipoh to refuel. It was intended that they go on to reconnoiter towards the Siamese border, but they were almost immediately scrambling back into their buffaloes after landing, this time to face a force of Key 27s coming in low to strafe the airfield. Viggers was soon tangled up with the Nates, or as he called them, the Army 97 fighters, as he recalls, quote, "I remember when we landed, there was an airman standing on the fence with a red flag, the early warning system. Long before we had a chance to refuel, he waved the flag wildly before disappearing into a ditch. I told my lads to get off the ground regardless, and immediately did so myself. One other buffalo managed to join me, and we climbed up over Penang, where I could see about 30 Army 97s showing their flag. We attacked these from above, giving us the advantage of surprise. I told my wingman, Sergeant O'Mara, that I was going into the middle of the enemy formation in order to break them up. The usual melee ensued, during which I was pretty certain I got hits on several of the Japs. But things were far too hot to bother about score. The Army 97 could turn right inside the buffalo, and I was a little too long in realizing the extent of their maneuverability. As a result, I received a direct hit in the petrol tank, which was situated under my feet. Somewhat naturally, the tank proceeded to blow up in my face. I used the old trick, which is undoubtedly the quickest way of getting out of an aircraft, of undoing my straps and kicking the stick. The only mistake I made was to pull the ripcord too early, with the result that within seconds I had what seemed to be the whole bloody Japanese Air Force shooting at me, from 10,000 feet down to when I eventually hit the deck on top of the Penang Mountains. Fortunately for me, they were rotten shots. The Japs continued to shoot at me until I made cover in some convenient jungle. Apparently it was expected by Allied airmen that the Japanese would fire on men in parachutes. Many pilots' accounts recall trying to free fall as long as possible before opening their chutes after being forced to abandon their aircraft. This was just one early indicator of the extremely grim and merciless kind of combat that would come to characterize the Pacific War. All 5 of this flight were damaged or lost in combat. 2 were forced to crash land, and another was shot down and seen to dive in. Its pilot, 23-year-old Sergeant Ron Elric, was killed. Flight Lieutenant Grace had the best of it, having shot down one of the Key 27s and bringing his shot-up fighter back safely to Ipoh. The squadron's war diary had this to say about it. Quote, "So our second engagement with the enemy was not so successful. Outnumbered by 10 to 1, and taken completely by surprise, the boys had no chance. One lesson we learned is never attempt to leave the ground when enemy aircraft are overhead. 7 weary pilots went into the town at night and took quarters at the station hotel in the Majestic. After a good feed and a few beers, all felt slightly better, but still considerably shaken by our first introduction to the real thing." Viggers, meanwhile, was in serious trouble up in the island's highlands. Quote, "All the skin had been burned off my hands, arms, and legs, and a good lot of it off my face. Also, I had a bullet straight through my left thigh, which somehow miraculously had missed both the bone and the main artery, having passed conveniently between the two. Having started my way down the mountain, I collapsed, and was picked up by a couple of little Malayans, a father and a 12-year-old son. I told them how to make a tourniquet, and we built a stretcher out of 2 branches, what remained of my Mae West, and their shirts. They carried me all day through a violent thunderstorm, down a precipitous mountain path, till we eventually hit a road and managed to stop a jeep. They accompanied me to the hospital, but the sad thing was that due to my being nearly unconscious at that time, I never got their names and addresses." The battered island of Penang was evacuated soon after, and Viggers was on his way that evening. Quote, "I was evacuated on a little boat which took us to the mainland. There followed an unpleasant 3 days, lying for the most part on the floor of a cattle truck, which eventually ended up in Singapore." Meanwhile, the final contingent of 453 Squadron left to join the others at Ipoh. The 3 buffaloes flown by pilot officers Tom Livesey and David Brown, and 36-year-old Wing Commander Leonard Neal, last of whom was to take command of the airfield on their arrival. Not long after takeoff, they ran into bad weather and became lost, as Livesey recounts. Quote, "Heading inland, we surged over very wild country with little sign of habitation. No landing fields, main roads, or towns. Finally, open ground was sighted below with an adjacent sandy beach. Fuel was also becoming short. Beating up the field so low that my propeller almost grazed the ground, I noted that it appeared to have wheat or corn growing on the surface. The top appeared firm enough for a wheels-down landing. Calling up the others, I said I would go down first and told them to watch my efforts before trying themselves. Livesey touched down only to find that the field was in fact a rice paddy full of ditches, and his aircraft somersaulted several times, ending up on its back. Somehow uninjured, he scrambled out and frantically tried to wave his companions off, but they seemed to interpret the waving to mean they should belly land, and came in with flaps down and wheels up. Quoting again, "Wing Commander Neal hit a tree on approach, spun in and his aircraft burst into flames. I struggled across to the fighter but could not get close due to the intensity of the fire. Turning around, I suddenly noticed Pilot Officer Brown's Buffalo a short distance away, also blazing. There were tracks or skid marks in the swamp, and it seemed he had stalled in at the last minute." Of the 13 453 Squadron Buffaloes sent from Sembawang to Ipoh, 7 were lost this day due to enemy action or accident, and most of the remainder had taken serious damage. Next day, the 243 Squadron detachment was pulled back to Singapore, but not before Fiskin and Wapiti took up a pair of Buffaloes to hit their recent base at Kota Bharu. This was again foiled by the persistent tropical rainstorms, as Fiskin relates, quote, "Ipoh was a very difficult aerodrome to land at, with 2 big high mountains on either side. Up on a mission to strafe the Jap troops at Kota Bharu, we were engulfed in heavy rain, so visibility was difficult and the pilot with me, Bert Wapiti, was inexperienced. He told me he hadn't flown at night since he left training school in New Zealand. I reckoned he wouldn't have had a show of landing in the middle of the night in a tropical storm, with these 2 mountains getting in the way. I radioed my commander at the base, 'It's raining like the hammers of hell up here. I can't see the end of the airdrome. My mate has no experience of bad weather flying.' I was pretty chuffed when the boss said abort the mission. I instructed Bert to keep close to me coming into land." There was no respite left for those at Ipoh, however. The progressive withdrawals of the Allied ground forces in the face of the Japanese push down the Western Trunk Road, southwards from Patani, had entirely disrupted the already scanty early warning system, and the Buffaloes were constrained to fly standing patrols over their airfield to avoid being caught defenseless on the ground. This was exhausting for the men and hard on the planes, but these patrols brought down at least 1 Japanese fighter, a Key 43 credited to Sergeant Alf Clare of 453 Squadron. This man would go on to shoot down more enemy aircraft in the Buffalo than any non-finished pilot. These patrols were kept up all day on the 14th, while ground crew worked tirelessly to get more planes ready for offensive action in support of the ground troops. Here they were hampered by the fact that no ground personnel had come forward with 453 Squadron's planes and pilots, and the understrength ground staff remaining to 21 Squadron had to take care of both. Nevertheless, 5 Buffaloes were made ready and sent to strafe Japanese troops reported advancing through rice paddies in the neighborhood of Alor Star. 2 of these became separated from the others in weather, but the remaining 3 carried out the strafing attack. Over their target, they encountered a 3-ship formation of Key 51 Sonyas, part of a larger group from the 27th Sentai sent to raid Ipoh. The Buffaloes went into the attack, but the bombers were flown with exceptional skill, and the Brewsters came off the worst for it. Flight Lieutenant Max White was killed by one of the Japanese rear gunners. Sergeant Seago reported hits on one of the enemy planes before losing contact with it. He went in for another strafing run on the enemy column below, and was hit and badly wounded in the shoulder by ground fire. The 3rd pilot, Sergeant Greg Board, had better luck, knocking down one of the bombers, which he misidentified as the Zero, after a fierce turning battle at treetop level. Quote, "Flame mushroomed from the wings, and almost at once a huge ball of red fire swept around the Zero, the blazing mass trailing greasy smoke into the jungle, where it disappeared in a blinding explosion." Board later found the wounded Seago and escorted him back to Ipoh. Some unusual good news came in the form of 3 unserviceable 21 Squadron Buffaloes returned to flight-worthy condition, flown up to Ipoh by pilots drawn from 62 Squadron, the Blenheim outfit that had been all but annihilated at Alor Star on the first day of the war. Even so, by the end of the day, none of the fighters were in fighting shape. The deteriorating situation is evident in the 453 Squadron's war diary. Quote, "Now we were in a sorry state. 6 serviceable pilots and not 1 fully serviceable aircraft. Our guns were particularly troublesome, and there seemed to be no one at Ipoh capable of keeping them in order. In addition, we were all very tired as the 6 of us had stayed on readiness from dawn till dusk. No arrangements were made for supplying us with food or drink, our only meal in the day being the one at night in the pub. Someone definitely slipped up on the organizing here, but who?" By the next morning, 3 Buffaloes were ready for action. These intercepted a force of 19 Key 48 bombers from the 90th Sentai, sent to hit the airfield. All 3 Buffaloes experienced stoppages of their guns. Despite this, one of the bombers was shot down by Sergeant Board. The Buffaloes were then set upon by Japanese fighters, forced to disengage, as Board relates. Quote, "Fortunately, there were enough loose clouds around for us to hide in, because if you mixed it in a dogfight with a Zero, the outcome was very clear. Very quickly, you were a dead man. Meanwhile, at Singapore, the 6 replacement Buffaloes were assembled and ready for the move to Ipoh. The squadron leader, Al Shorn, wished to delay the flight due to the prevailing bad weather, but was overruled by his immediate superior, Group Captain Rice, so he took off onto low cloud and rain at 0600 with the 5 other machines in company. His radio went dead not long after takeoff, and the group became separated. 4 turned back to Singapore, 3 of which made it, the other forced landing in a paddy field. Al Shorn, in company with Flight Lieutenant Kinnenmont, pressed on, but were compelled to put down in a disused airstrip between Singapore and Port Swettenham. Kinnenmont followed him in, but overran the strip and flipped his plane on its back. None of the aircraft made it to Ipoh. Later that day, the weather cleared, and the 3 planes that made it back to Singapore joined 7 more from Sembawang that did move up to Ipoh. These were led by 453 Squadron Leader Harper, who had just returned from Australia to take command of the 2 squadrons there. He recorded his impressions of the situation at Ipoh in some detail, and they're worth quoting at some length. Quote, "I found that the morale of both squadrons had dropped. Both units had suffered some losses, and Flight Lieutenant Viggers, who had come from Kelantan to command number 453 in my absence, had been shot down in flames on his first sortie. Several matters required immediate attention, but the most serious was the considerable losses we were suffering of our irreplaceable aircraft that were being destroyed on the ground, and I decided that if we were to be able to operate at all at the end of another 7 days, we must stop this heavy drain on our numbers. The landing ground position was disastrous for fighter operations. There was only one landing ground, and that was at Ipoh. The surrounding country was jungle, rubber, or mountainous, and we had no facilities for airstrip construction. Ipoh Airfield consisted of a usable strip with another at right angles to it at the north end, which was too small for any of the latest types of aircraft. A narrow macadam taxi track led off from the usable strip, and off this track lay the dispersal pens. However, there were no pens and no other possible means of dispersing the aircraft on the strip itself, owing to the Japanese ground strafing tactics. Our only alternative was to have the aircraft either in the air or along the taxi track in their dispersal pens, as we had no warning system. The taxi track to the dispersal pens was exceedingly narrow, and it was inviting disaster to taxi without a man at each wingtip. Furthermore, the track was dangerously undulating. There were no means of passing aircraft which had become bogged through a wheel running off the track. It was necessary for all pilots to exercise extreme care, as many of the pens were a remarkably long way distant at the end of this winding track. It was nearly impossible to get a flight or squadron onto the strip for takeoff in less than 20 minutes, by which time it would have been too late to intercept any enemy aircraft. The lack of early warning was of particular concern. Quote, "The airfield was located in a valley, and if no air cover was in the air while the aircraft prepared for takeoff, Japanese fighters or bombers, signaled by spies located in the nearby hills, would attack our aircraft when they were on the ground or taking off. Furthermore, almost invariably when our aircraft were landing, Japanese aircraft attacked if no top cover was available. In any case, they usually attacked the top cover when it attempted to land. This problem was discussed with the officer commanding Norgroup, and I proposed that the only solution to operating from Ipoh lay in some form of warning system. This was agreed, and I was instructed to prepare a fighter ops system. A crude observer system was available, which theoretically gave us reasonable cover. However, there were practically no signal specialists available to us, and very little equipment. We had to rely on asking assistance from the local anti-aircraft unit for our telephone equipment. The telephones, which literally must have been some of the first that were ever made, were totally unreliable. The observer system, which I had to use, had been organized by Fighter Ops Kalang, and under it, we were unable to get reports on approaching enemy aircraft direct from the observer posts, but got them instead through the railway station master at Kuala Lumpur. Owing to delays attendant on this system, we usually got our warning that the Japanese were 40 miles away just as the raid was on. I had with me in the ops room the colonel commanding the local anti-aircraft unit, and we occasionally got helpful information from him on approaching enemy raiders. Considerable delays were experienced, however, through the telephone lines, which ran through the jungle, being cut by either fifth columnists, of whom there were plenty, or by bombing. Indeed, there were many aspects of the situation at Ipoh which did not favorably impress him, quoting again. As soon as the operations system was completed, I tried to instruct our 4 flight commanders so that they could take a turn at controlling in order to relieve me, but they had no knowledge of controlling units, and they needed supervision if we were to intercept any raiders. Unfortunately, the day after the completion of the ops system, the Army lost ground, and we lost our observer posts. During the 2 days that were necessary to construct the fighter control system, including the provision of a suitable ground station, as there were none up to that time, I arranged for a constant cover of 4 aircraft from each of the 2 squadrons throughout daylight. This was expensive, as we'd anticipated, on engine hours, but as we were not attacked once during that period, it gave us 2 days' valuable respite in which to reorganize and repair the aircraft. The need for reorganization was considerable. The aircraft of the 2 squadrons were being serviced by the ground crews of only 21 Squadron RAAF. This unit's ground crew strength was totally inadequate for 1 squadron, let alone 2, and the vast majority of guns in the aircraft would not fire because of the rust which the troops had not had time to clean off. I had signaled to Singapore for armorers for my squadron as soon as I had reached Ipoh. 3 men had arrived before we retreated from the airfield and had improved the guns considerably before we left. Inspections were also not being done, and the aircraft were rapidly becoming unreliable. The ex-civil airline engines on the Buffaloes were quite unsuited to the treatment they were getting in combat and on the ground, and many developed a serious loss of power. The reorganization of the station was also a serious and pressing problem. There was no appointed station commander. Food was an urgent need. The men were going without food, and so were the pilots. There was no suitable accommodation, and as the men and pilots were sleeping without mosquito nets under any available covering, I feared malaria. I therefore requisitioned accommodation in a hotel at Ipoh, and sent out the cooks with money to buy food. I also tried to introduce certainty and reliability into the organization so that morale should be improved. Transport was lacking at first and caused grave difficulties. Spare parts for aircraft were usually obtained by the cannibal system, but oxygen was not available. Neither 21 Squadron RAAF or 453 Squadron were equipped with either men or equipment for the role that they had been given. And while expected to be self-supporting, they had neither trained cooks, motor transport, or sufficient specialist staff or equipment to do their duty as they would have liked to do it. Furthermore, nearly all native labor on which we had to rely had disappeared when the war became dangerous. I believe, from hearsay, that these circumstances were foreseen by the RAAF headquarters at Sembawang sometime before the war started. Meanwhile, the Japanese were not standing still. Much time and effort was wasted on attacks on the abandoned airfields, where unserviceable planes abandoned there still attracted attention. The Japanese Navy's aircraft also renewed their efforts, with strikes on eastern Malaya targets flown from Indochina, such as one on Kuala Trengganu by 24 G3Ms of the Genzan Koktai. More worryingly, Ki-51 light bombers and Ki-36 Army cooperation planes of the 36th Independent Hikotai moved from Singora to captured Alor Star. Here they found the airfield mostly intact, with a full bomb dump and more than 1,000 drums of aviation fuel intact in the rubber tree thickets on the fringes. Within hours of its capture, these planes were flying ground attack missions in support of the advancing 5th Division, using captured bombs and fuel. Attacks on Ipoh resumed on the 17th, and despite the standing patrols of Buffaloes that were maintained, they were unable to stop the steady attrition of their fighters, both in the air and on the ground. By the evening of the 18th, 453 Squadron was ordered to fall back on Kuala Lumpur with all of its serviceable aircraft, of which there were no more than 7, where they would be joined by the ground crews and brought back to full strength. 21 Squadron and its doubtless exhausted ground personnel were ordered back to Singapore to reorganize. Sergeant Board gives this impression of the evacuation. Quote, "The men couldn't bury their dead. There were too many of them. They packed the living and the wounded into trucks, buried bombs in the runway, and as soon as we got into the air, they set the bombs off and tore up the airstrip. Then they drove for their lives to Kuala Lumpur, where we began the bloody struggle over again." Squadron Leader Harper led the flight to their new operating base, which he describes in these words, quote, "The Kuala Lumpur airfield was a single strip, which was being partly reconstructed. There were no dispersals, and we had aircraft spread out around the strip and covered with branches from trees. The ground crews with tankers did not arrive until later that day, and no operations were carried out. An operations room and warning system were again in the course of being formed, but were not ready in time to control us successfully by the time we left for Singapore. It did seem at first that there was every chance of our being able to get down to some regular operations from Kuala Lumpur. The Japanese ground troops were about 100 miles away, and I anticipated that we had 10 clear days at least in which to operate. Our first task was to get the aircraft fully serviceable, and to utilize our troops so that the squadron was on a working basis with facilities for food and accommodation. Men and supplies converged here from the other recently abandoned airfields of Sungai Petani, Butterworth, and Taiping, the latter being a satellite field of Ipoh. A good deal of fuel, ammunition, and other essentials were got away, but still much was left for the use of the Japanese. When the 27th and 59th Sentais occupied Sungai Petani, they found 1,500 drums of aviation fuel. From this base, they could hit Kuala Lumpur. By the 21st, the raids began. 6 repaired buffaloes were sent to reinforce the Allied squadrons before the renewed onslaught. The first standing patrol of the morning had just landed when the first attack wave, made up of 14 Key 51s and Key 48s, escorted by 12 Key 43s from the 59th Sentai, appeared inbound to the field. Sergeants Bill Collier and Mac Reed were at readiness, but were caught on the ground by the attack, as Collier recounts, quote, "We jumped out of the aircraft and into the nearest slit trench. One bomb landed about 5 feet away from the lip of the trench. It did not do any damage, even though the aircraft were only a few feet away. The ground was very soft, and the bomb made a hole about 3 feet deep, so I suppose all the blast was directed upwards. It made me a great supporter of slit trenches." Another raid came in later that day, and was intercepted by the 2 buffaloes up on patrol. Sergeant Eric Peterson shot down one of the bombers, while the Japanese fighter escort shot down his wingman, Sergeant Ross Lace, who parachuted to safety. Credit for his plane was awarded to Sergeant Hiroshi Onozaki, the pilot of the 59th Sentai. No more action occurred that day, and 3 more replacements arrived from Singapore. They would be needed, because the largest and most decisive air battle of the campaign was about to occur. On the morning of the 22nd, the reinforced 453 Squadron had 12 buffaloes fit for combat, and these were all sent up to patrol at 1000 hours, under the command of Flight Lieutenant Vanderfield. While flying at 7,000 feet, a few Japanese fighters were spotted, with another dozen behind and above. These were from the crack 64th Sentai, flying brand new Key 43 Hayabusas, and this was the first mission in Malaya in which this formation played a leading role. The 18 pilots were led by Major Tateo Kato. They had taken off from Kota Bharu and were approaching Kuala Lumpur at altitudes between 7,000 and 10,000 feet. Some distance behind came a group of Key 48 and Key 51 bombers. The Japanese dove on the buffaloes, and a wild melee lasting almost half an hour began. One of the 453 pilots, Sergeant Harry Griffiths, recalls the action in this way, quote, "I observed approximately 20 enemy aircraft coming down sun. I called up base saying that I was about to engage about 20 enemy fighters. The reply was unmistakably the voice of Harper. He said, 'Well, good luck. When you finish with them, there's a further 20 above them and still more above them.' Alf Clare had a big grin and gave me a thumbs up. Greg Board, for some reason, pulled away going in a steep dive, and I did not see him again that day. Then it was on. Aircraft were milling everywhere. Everyone seemed to be getting mixed up, and then to my surprise an enemy aircraft appeared straight in front of me. I gave him a good burst and saw pieces break away and the aircraft start to burn. He went into a flattish spin. I then saw one of our aircraft, which I identified as Sergeant O'Mara's, about 500 feet lower, being pursued by one of the enemy, who was firing at him from behind. I was in a perfect position but had to aim at O'Mara's tail to allow for deflection. I pressed the button, and as my bullets hit, I saw a flash of flame. The aircraft spiraled upwards, rolling onto its back, and then dived towards the ground with smoke trailing. That evening, O'Mara complained bitterly that one of our own aircraft had fired at him. It was then that I was hit. A cannon shell hit my port mainplane, puncturing a full 90-gallon fuel tank. The fuel siphoned out, soaking me in the aircraft. Why we didn't burst into flames, I'll never know. The 2 aircraft continued firing at me until they both ran out of ammunition. One of them formated on me very close, the pilot grinning and gesticulating with his hand at something. He was so close that I fired 2 or 3 rounds at him from my revolver before he slipped away a short distance, then completed a perfect barrel roll around me, finishing the roll back in perfect formation, it being the first barrel roll I'd ever seen. There was little I could do, so I went around a hill, hoping he would follow me across the airdrome, where the Bofors gun opened up. And I looked behind, he was nowhere to be seen, having broken off some time before reaching the field. The damn fool Indian gunners were firing at me. Griffiths was able to land safely despite heavy damage to his buffalo, minor wounds in his head and right hand. He is credited with 2 victories. Pilot Officer Tom Livesey took off to join the battle swirling over the airfield. He had trouble getting airborne and hit his undercarriage on a sandbank, protecting a gun emplacement at the end of the runway as he lifted off the ground. Undaunted, he climbed away with one leg of his gear dangling and trailing vapor from its hydraulics. Quote, "My fighter, perhaps not delivering full power, had lost both wheels. Only the stumps were left hanging down. Zero seemed to be everywhere, and the dogfight was mostly on the treetops, rarely above 1,000 feet. When the main battle broke up, I found that 4 of the enemy were giving me their undivided attention. This went on for what seemed like hours, but in actual fact was probably about 20 minutes. It was twist and turn, constant violent maneuvers, and the smell of gunfire and hot oil. Eventually my pursuers gave up, either low on fuel or out of ammunition. Figuring I was south of base, I headed north and gained a little altitude. Later, when everything seemed okay, I had another look around. Blood on the cockpit floor. I'd been too busy to realize that I'd been hitting my leg. There had been a rattling bump of machine gun and cannon fire hitting my aircraft, but surely not me, too. On arrival back at Kuala Lumpur, because there was no hydraulics or wheels, I switched everything off for a once-only approach. Lining up on the strip, I heaved a sigh of relief and coasted in. Both friendly ACAC guns opened up on me and kept it up all the way in. Sergeant Warren Gillespie was watching from the ground. Quote, "We sat on the airfield and watched a fantastic dogfight that started at about 15,000 feet. The ground crew were laying down on the airstrip, firing their rifles at the Japanese fighters. There were aircraft, both Australian and Japanese, maneuvering in all directions. I saw George Scrimger being machine gunned by a Japanese fighter as he came down in his parachute. George had bailed out at 10,000 feet, right over the airdrome. You could see the Zero diving at him and shooting at him. We sent out a truck to pick him up when he landed. Bob Drury came in badly wounded. I waved at him because he was coming in too low. He hit an embankment at the end of the strip, and the engine just shot right out the front of his Buffalo." Scrimger survived and had this to say about his experience. Quote, "The Buffalo was an easy target from head-on because of its large belly. I was involved in a head-on attack with a Zero. We were firing into each other and the Buffalo caught on fire. Fire flamed back from the belly into the cockpit. My face and eyelashes were burned because I'd lost my flying goggles in a tight turn. My wrists and fingers were burned because I was not wearing flying gloves. I decided to bail out even though I was at low altitude. I was not keen on taking to the parachute because I'd seen Japanese fighters firing at Ross Lace the day before when he had bailed out. On my way down, a Japanese fighter made 3 passes at me. I counted 25 bullet holes in the canopy, but he didn't hit me because I was able to change the direction of the parachute by pulling on the ripcord. But in doing this, I pulled the skin off my fingers where I'd been burned. In all of our fighter actions in the Malayan Campaign, the Japs were always above us. The only time I got near a Japanese fighter with a good chance of shooting him down was in a dogfight over Ipoh. But there was nothing I could do, because the glycol leak had completely covered my windscreen and I could see nothing." Sergeant Bill Collier was hit early on in the combat, and he recounts his part in the battle thus, quote, "I saw Zero attacking one of the Buffaloes about 500 feet below. The pilot of the Buffalo could not get his wheels up. Zero had made a couple of attacks and was pulling up after each one into a stall turn. Just as I made my attack on the Zero, another Zero attacked me, and many of its bullets from the second Zero hit the aircraft that I was attacking. I'd say that between the 2 of us we got him. Quite a few bullets hit my aircraft, including one which flew just past my ear, hit the priming pump, and went down into my right foot. I pulled up hard to the left and found myself doing a head-on attack on another aircraft. I just kept firing at his prop spinner until I broke off below him. I heard his engine as he passed over me. I think the bugger would have rammed me if I hadn't got out of his way. However, I don't think my .5s would have done his engine any good. He might have had a bad trip from then on. All this happened in the first few seconds. From then on, there was a general mix-up. I finished up within sight of the coast. My engine had been damaged. The aircraft had been badly shot up. It was not possible to make any kind of assessment of what damage had been done, and I thought the worst that could happen would be a wheels-up landing on the wide mud flats, which were exposed at low tide on that part of the coast. So I just kept flying south and eventually got to Semboang. On the approach to land, I discovered that the wing flap on the left side would not work, and the right flap was only partly down and came up again. On touchdown, one tire was found to be punctured. A bit of a hairy landing. After landing, Collier was hospitalized. His Buffalo was found to have more than 70 holes in it, and a slug was found in the engine crankcase. To see the view from the other side of the hill, we can turn to the account of Japanese Army aviator Lieutenant Yohei Hinoki, who on this day was flying wingman to the formation leader. In this excerpt, he refers to the Key 43s by their Allied reporting name, Oscar. Quote, "Takayama's formation flew at 7,000 feet, north of Kuala Lumpur Airfield, at 11:40 on the day. Kato's formation was at 10,000 feet. I saw the Oscar of Lieutenant Takayama be shaken by the sudden burst of anti-aircraft fire. The wingman, Second Lieutenant Aito Kikuchi, and Sergeant Major Choichi Okuyama were thrown up by the intense burst. seeing that Takayama's aircraft was hit and damaged by the anti-aircraft fire. Then we spotted around 15 buffaloes which were ascending. Lieutenant Takayama and Sergeant Major Okuyama attacked the right-hand buffalo of the tail formation leader. They approached it from behind and above. Lieutenant Oyazumi's Oscars attacked the left formation. The formation of buffaloes were scattered, and Captain Katsumi Anma caught a buffalo, but he could not fire at it due to mechanical fault. His wingman, Lieutenant Takeshi Endo, fired at it, but his machine guns also stopped after 5 or 6 rounds. Then I saw another Oscar fire at the buffalo, which spouted black smoke from the engine. Lieutenant Takayama was chasing a buffalo when Major Kato signaled to close the combat. Lieutenant Takayama continued to chase it to very low altitude. Wingman Sergeant Major Okuyama followed them and saw the Oscar of Lieutenant Takayama was broken when he tried to pull to avoid colliding with the buffalo. Okuyama did not witness whether Takayama had collided with the buffalo, or if his plane had been broken by the heavy stress against the wing root. So it seems the Japanese had some problems with their guns as well. Worse problems were indicated by the structural failure referred to in this account as Takayama's plane being broken. A wing came off of Takayama's plane in a tight turn. After landing, the squadron's other Ki-43s were inspected, and several were found to have stress fractures in the wing roots. Engineers from Japan were flown out to strengthen the weak wing structure and to investigate the gun failures, but his pilots were advised to restrict their combat maneuvers until the problem was solved. This battle left 453 Squadron with a mere handful of damaged planes, but they had gone down swinging, and though conflicting claims make it hard to be exact, between 8 and 10 Japanese planes fell to their guns. Apparently the bombers were turned back as well, as no mention is made of the airfield being bombed. If so, this is the only instance of a Japanese bombing raid being prevented by Allied air defense in Malaya. This is no small achievement by men, most of whom were not long out of training and handicapped by technical and organizational deficiencies in the face of a more numerous and better equipped enemy. A few Japanese planes crashed in the vicinity of the airfield. At least one of the airmen survived and was captured, as described by Sergeant Harry Blackham of the 5th Regiment of the Royal Artillery, found a survivor and was probably a Ki-51 bomber. Quote, "We leveled our guns at him. He appeared demented, and speaking fair but disjointed English, entreated us to kill him. He grabbed the muzzle of one of the rifles and put it against his chest, saying, 'Shoot, shoot!' He apparently wished to die for his emperor, but Captain McEwen felt he was too valuable a prize to be given that pleasure, and ordered us to take him to our truck. We found his automatic pistol under his thigh, cocked and with the safety off. It seemed his desire to die for his emperor was not so strong as we'd thought." Another crashed Japanese pilot didn't survive long enough to be captured, as remembered by Sergeant Harry Griffith. Quote, "Another strange occurrence was an enemy fighter that crash-landed not far from the aerodrome. The pilot got out and was running for cover when one of his own team machine-gunned him, killing him. They then strafed the aircraft and set it on fire. I did not witness this action, but I have no reason to doubt it, as a number of the ground crew assured me that they'd seen it happen. Battered as the squadron was, they were still not out of the woods. In the afternoon, more Ki-43s, most likely from 59th Sentai this time, attacked the airfield at low level, as noted in the squadron's war diary. Quote, "Readiness was continued for the rest of the day with the remaining serviceable aircraft and pilots. At about 15:30, the signal was given to take off, and the aircraft commenced to taxi out. But before they could get to the end of the runway, out of the clouds dived 4 Zeros with all guns blazing. Following our lesson at Butterworth, all the pilots except Pete, meaning Sergeant Eric Peterson, a 24-year-old native of Sydney, quickly got out of their aircraft and dived for the scrub. Pete can't have seen the Zeros as they came in from behind him. He got off the deck, but they were on him immediately, and he spun in and crashed from about 700 feet. Pete was killed." The same war diary noted this day as the, quote, "Buffalo's last stand in Malaya," and indeed the squadron was all but destroyed as a fighting unit. 4 pilots had been lost and presumed killed, including Sergeant Mac Reed, whose Buffalo was seen to collide with the Ki-43, possibly that of Takayama. Kuala Lumpur had quickly proven itself just as untenable as Ipoh. With the decimation of 453 Squadron, Nor Group was officially disbanded. The remaining flyable aircraft, 7, of which only 3 were fit to fight, were once again evacuated, this time all the way back to Sembawang. The Allied air forces in Malaya had been pushed out of the peninsula altogether, and now stood at the last stop, Singapore itself. And that is where I will end this video. Hope you were able to get something interesting or useful out of it. Next time will bring us to the final battle of the Malaya Campaign, as the Japanese push past the final obstacles on the peninsula and begin the reduction of Singapore by air in preparation for the final battle for the fortress island itself. Till that time, I remain Mark 7, wishing you all the best.